Excellent. So to try to keep this going on time as well as we can, introduce myself. My name is George Abernathy. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for FreightWaves. I've been in the industry for about 28 to 30 years or so. I've worked in both the asset, non-asset, and technology side in transportation and logistics, and most recently I was at Transplace for about 12 years, including the last 6 I was president. So let's just go down the road and do the intros, and then I'll take over.
So Craig? I'm Craig. Glad to be here. Very excited. I founded FreightWaves, which, as you know, is the host. So we're excited to be joined with some of our team. What we want to talk about today is actually talk about the freight markets, use data to support it. We work and partner with companies in the IoT space to understand what the market's doing. It's all aggregated data, all anonymized, and we're trying to understand all the metrics of the industry. And so we're going to dive into that today.
Excellent.
My name is Ibrahim Bain. I'm the chief economist here at FreightWaves. I joined the company earlier this year. Before joining FreightWaves, I was the senior economist at UPS. I did a lot of economic forecasting, developing models explaining how the macroeconomy influenced the transportation markets. I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Rutgers University before attending the PhD program at Emory University right here in Atlanta, Georgia.
Hey, I'm Daniel Pickett. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at FreightWaves. I was leading data science for financial organizations at USAA, then did bond trading for the last few years and heard about the opportunity to launch a futures market and the explosion of data that's in the transportation industry, and joined FreightWaves last year.
Good morning. My name is Dean Croak, Chief Analytics Officer at FreightWaves. My career kind of spans 2 parts. One is doing a few million miles as an over-the-road driver in Australia and managing and running large truck fleets and some big logistics contracts. And the other is for the last 20 years being here in the US using telematics data to understand driver behavior and physiology as it relates to safety and risk management.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. To talk about the future, I think talking about the present would make some sense. So Dean, given the few million miles that you've driven, I'm going to start with you on the always right now hot topic on ELDs. We're about a month and a half or a month and 3 weeks after the enforcement time frame. What do you see right now in the marketplace around ELDs?
Yes, so it's a really passionate subject of mine. And you know, as a driver, I did about 2 million miles as a driver, and one of the occupational hazards is falling asleep at the wheel. And we kind of used to just accept it, but the reality is, even though we were compliant with our logs, we would always have these moments where we'd fall asleep at the wheel during the night. So, this would happen a dozen times a night, and even though I've got a couple of million miles as a driver, I'm technically accident-free. The reality is that when you run off the road in Australia, there's nothing to hit in the outback. So I'm technically an accident-free driver, but the reality is a lot of those miles I can't remember because I was asleep, and the brain's not designed to remember. Memory doesn't work when you sleep, so you don't remember falling asleep. And the other is that you have no recollection of how all these sort of things manifest. So after I lost a couple of drivers on a big logistics contract, I had to go to a spouse and family and tell them that their father had died. And I knew that on my watch, it literally took 5 seconds for these guys to kill themselves. So that was a life-changing event. I ended up meeting a Harvard professor and studying human physiology at Harvard, and I found out why it happens, and in these 5-second momentary lapses, people can make some disastrous decisions. So that's the perspective of what I'm about to tell you, and there's 3 things that I think are happening with electronic logs. One is, I don't think the safety outcomes will be what people think. There is no direct correlation between safety and compliance to unsafe regulations. The reality is that you can be 100% compliant to hours of service regulations and sound asleep at the wheel multiple times every night. There's no correlation between the two, so don't go down that path. The other is our data is showing that drivers are making different decisions every week now with electronic logs based on where they are in their duty cycle. So if a driver's at 52 hours of his 60 and he's got a 10-hour load or a 12-hour, or say 12-hour dispatch or whatever it is, on Thursday, if he's only got 10 hours and it needs 11, they're making very different decisions on a Thursday now about what type of loads they haul. And the other thing is that we're seeing drivers now decide differently about what sort of, or fleets putting what sort of driver configurations together, whether it's team or solo. That Tweener freight in that 750-mile range that used to be next day delivery for one driver, we're now seeing it with teams. And lastly, productivity. Fleets that run paper logs typically run about 10% more miles per tractor week. So what we're seeing is, and this was the objective of the large fleets that ran electronic logs, was to try and level the playing field, not for safety, but for competitive reasons. So fleets that are now running paper logs, that are now running e-logs that were paper, they're running about 10% less miles.
Interesting. Daniel, it's interesting commentary. What's our data shown as you've done some analysis?
Yeah, great question. So we don't have a great data source for paper logs, but in terms of what ELDs show, I'd like to kind of talk to you about what we saw in Chicago. So everybody talked about soft mandate was December, I think 18th, and this was going to be doom and gloom, and it kind of coincided with Christmas rush. So I've yet to see a really convincing argument that it was ELDs that caused kind of the spike in demand there. That's kind of what Christmas looks like. And so, Zach, will you show me the tender reject for Chicago? That's typical. But basically what happens is as you approach April 1st, that's when we said, okay, they're going to start writing tickets if you're adjusting your logs and doing things that look suspicious. So everybody kind of expected this sudden capacity crunch. It didn't show up in our data. Really, as we approached April 1st and hit April 1st, we were seeing some of the least tender reject index levels we'd seen in 6 months on a lot of cities. And here's here's Chicago, a great example.
So see it on the screen.
April 1st.
We need to cast that up to the screen if the guys in the back can hear that.
Anyway, April 1st.
There we go. Thank you.
Most of the cities across the country, what you saw was the lowest levels of rejections. And so we really didn't see it. Not until early May have things started to kind of warm up with the weather.
Yeah, so what you're looking at right here is what we call the tender reject. And so if you think about electronic transactions, if you think about freight, the assumption that a lot of folks outside the industry make is that most of the transactions are by voice. That's actually not the case. Most large shippers and anybody in this room probably recognizes that the vast majority of freight is electronically tendered, particularly of the large enterprise companies. And what they do is they send out these RFPs and they have companies in a route guide and they send out those electronic transactions based on the commitments that they've made. I don't like the word contract freight and spot freight because the word contract, as I learned talking to the financial markets folks, means that you have a firm commitment and it's a take or pay. We know freight doesn't work that way. So to understand how companies in the freight industry are actually reacting to the current market conditions, we went out and sourced electronic tender transactions to look at whether or not companies are honoring the commitments they made to shippers. This is an example of the Chicago market. We like Chicago market because it is if you think about the industrial economy of the United States, Chicago is the bellwether. It is also not artificially skewed by things like produce or oil markets that you'll see in Texas. So if you want to understand the state of the industrial economy, we look at Chicago. And what you see is if you look at November, you see the Thanksgiving rush, that's that first surge. If you go to December 16th, which was the soft mandate, you can actually see this massive surge directly correlated to that date. What that's suggesting is that drivers during this soft mandate were actually trying to respond to the conditions of the market, and there was a lot of rejections in the market from electronic tenders because they were not prepared to take the loads. They didn't like the price, they didn't like the conditions, they didn't like the lane. A lot of reasons for that. So we saw a lot of instability through the holidays, and if you kind of go through January till about Valentine's Day, you see the market has a substantial, I can't see the number right in front of me, but what's the number? It's about 30% rejections up until about 35%. And then about Valentine's Day, we started to see a little bit of the capacity loosening. So if you're a third-party logistics company that had fixed rates, you probably saw the spot market rates start to actually taper off. And so I would expect to see margin expansion in the first quarter if you had fixed rates. What we also saw is if you go to the hard mandate, which a lot of predictions were in the market, the analysts were talking about, massive capacity crunch, you would expect to see the rejections go through the roof. We didn't see that at all. In fact, we saw the exact opposite. We actually saw a tapering of the rejections, which we think are indicative of two elements. One is the drivers over the period of the 4 months got much more comfortable with how to use an ELD device. They started to change how they operated, and new bids went into effect during that cycle. So we think what we've talked to shippers actually accelerated their bid cycles and implemented them in that mid-February market. They added dedicated to their constructs of their shipping because they didn't want to lose capacity because of what happened late last year. And so you can actually see it. Now, what we also see in Chicago is that the market kind of bottomed, the spot market the rejections bottomed in early May, and now we're on a period of a rebound.
Interesting. Let me bridge to that a little bit as you talk about drivers and their behavior. This may be a little bit controversial, but I'll ask the guy on the dais up here that has his CDL. I've heard flexibility mentioned by you. I've heard that drivers may be being pushed with ELDs. Are they cheating? Are they capable of cheating?
So in defense of the Brotherhood of Truckers, I would suggest it's more about creative accounting.
That gets you in trouble, Dean.
Yeah, it's a subject taught in every truck stop in the country. It's a really good application for blockchain, actually, and we need learning machines and Natalie and Jamil to figure out a way to help drivers understand through blockchain how to be certified for creative accounting practices. The reality is that paper logs afford a level of flexibility, and one of the myths is that people think that drivers cheat on their logs to do more hours. The reality is they just want to do the hours differently. And by that I mean a day is broken up into 3 blocks, 11 on, 3 other, and 10 off. And what they're trying to do is preserve the 3, because the 3 is when they sit on docks and burn time when they're not paid. So what drivers would do with paper logs is you'd bump a dock and you'd go to off-duty on line 1, and that preserves your time, so because you're not getting paid for that time. So what we're seeing now is that drivers are making very different decisions, because now every minute is accountable. And what it means is when they hit a dock, they either have to go onto line 4 on duty non-driving, and they don't get paid for the first 90 minutes of unloading. And unless you've got the Convoy automated detention pay app where you get paid for every minute you spend after 2 hours, you have to make a trade-off decision. Do I record every minute on a dock, part of which is not paid, or do I go off duty to preserve my hours so I can run 60 miles at $1.80? So there's actually this decision process you have to make now, because every minute of the day is now accountable. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's lack of flexibility that's really the problem, not this myth that people want to do more.
Daniel, Dan, I just want to ask, I don't want to say, is it possible that Dean is asleep at the wheel, but is your data showing you what Dean is surmising?
No, I think that's exactly what you're seeing. So Zach's put up the HOS 11 is your 11-hour clock you were talking about. And we've seen drivers squeeze, over the last, I'd say year to date, they've squeezed out about an extra 20 minutes of driving on average per day. There on the left, you can see the blue, the moving average trending up. The 14-hour clock is your driving time, right, plus that on-duty time that he's talking about, where I would expect to see that trend up by 20 minutes too. So either they're sprinting around at gas pumps and docks and their safety inspection, but the data says there's a lot of sleeping and off-duty happening in the middle of the day at docks.
That green is interesting because it actually shows a direct correlation to the hard mandate. And so you can actually see on the chart where the green is showing for the first time if you go to the mandate, you're actually seeing where it took place, and you're seeing that drivers are responding differently, looking at these are actual telematics and ELD devices, and you see that in the 11-hour set, but you don't see it in the 14-hour set.
Yeah, and that extra drive time may be part of the reason we didn't see the April 1st spike.
So what's interesting about that is that's about a 5% increase in available hours across the board. This data set's quite large in terms of hundreds of thousands of ELD devices, so it's a representative sample of the overall market. And you're actually seeing an increase in capacity that we, as an industry, as a tech industry, talk about optimization. It's just driver behavior optimization.
Exactly.
And so I think it's incredibly interesting that actually in the behavior of the driver.
Yeah, we're seeing the creative accounting Dean talks about.
So let me ask one more question on drivers, and then I'll move on to a different topic. Dean, based on the behavioral changes and the like, are ELDs making drivers safer?
So I would say no. There are some elements of the hours of service regs that have some good safety benefits, such as having to stop for 30 minutes every 8 hours. In other countries, it's every half an hour every 5 hours. So I would advocate for more rest breaks over more periods. But the reality is that drivers are being forced to make decisions now around regulations, not how they feel. Because safety is something that happens in the brain. It doesn't happen in a regulation and an electronic log. And we did some data analytics here. I did sort of a study of fleets. I took 30 fleets over a period of 6 years, and they did about 12 billion miles annually, both the fleets combined. And what I did, I knew as a driver that paper logs would make you safer. I knew electronic logs, having run multiple logs and electronic logs and a driver diary and honor system, I knew that you would be less safe if you had to comply to unsafe regulations. So what we found was that fleets that ran paper logs in 2006, 2007, were about 30% safer in terms of severe accidents, the DOT recordables. A DOT recordable is a fatality, an injury, or some vehicle is towed away from the scene. So these are the bad wrecks. So fast forward to 2011, when the paper log fleets now introduced electronic logs, they both have pretty much the same DOT recordable accident rate. So, my view is that being compliant to unsafe regs through ELD mandate will actually make the 2 million trucks that have now gone on to ELDs less safe.
I don't think look, we like ELD. You can't get the version of truth if you don't have a tracking device. But I think you've been pretty passionate about the 14-hour rule, and the 14-hour rule takes the decision availability of the driver to feel how, imagine, we've been hosting this conference for the last couple of days. I'm exhausted. I would not want to be driving an 80,000-pound truck across the highway. And so it's taking the ability of the driver to decide how they feel at that very moment that I think is taken away from them, and it's forced compliance. And so it's interesting that while it's not the technology itself that will make drivers safer, it's how the technology responds to the regulations and how we implement those that very well.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're 7 weeks in or 5 weeks in, whatever we are, to hard mandates. So it's something we're definitely by the end of the year going to have some good data on to follow up and maybe do this again.
Absolutely.
I see them starting to kind of figure out how to be creative, and so hopefully we won't see that 30% increase over this year.
Well, I hope so too.
Hope so. Okay, I'm gonna turn a little bit because our time is somewhat limited. Craig, I'm gonna throw one to you and turn over to the shippers. With all that's happening, all the data that has been analyzed that we've been looking at recently, what do you think the behavioral change that a shipper needs to do today in today's marketplace?
Well, I think the great things about ELD devices is you get the version of truth. We now have a map of really where drivers are being delayed, how long it's taking to go from point A to point B. We know which specific facilities they're being delayed at. And we've never had the opportunity to have an efficient map because the telematics companies, the folks that had telematics and ELD devices skewed to the larger fleets. But to get a large enough sample of where the delays are, and think about the large fleets are in drop and hook freight.
Yep.
So they're not seeing the types of delays that you would expect at the docks because a lot of their freight's preloaded. But when you move into the owner-operator, which is really spot and live loaded, I think ELDs actually enable us the ability to get a map of locations.
Yeah, absolutely. Shippers that have bad detention are going to pay more in their rates than shippers that don't. We actually did a study and found what are the worst docks in the country. So we started zooming in, figuring out what companies they are. And we found one that was particularly bad. And about a month later, they reached out to us and said, hey, we're having trouble getting trucks. Can you guys help us figure out what's going on? So we found these two facilities that they own side by side and kind of ran what the ELD data says at their two facilities. And they weren't sure which one was the problem. And pretty quickly, we not only said, okay, we know which facility it is, but we even know which side. It's in your southeast corner, never been there, know nothing about it. But you can even see down at the dock door level. And they immediately said, we kind of know about a specific situation in that area of the
let's be clear, because we didn't set out to actually map their docks.
No, that was not the goal.
We were mapping, you guys, I didn't do it, divided up the whole country in 200-foot squares and
look for hotspots.
And 3 of the 4 worst docks in America happen to be the shipper.
Yep.
And I told the story yesterday that we were going to publish the name of the shipper, but then our attorney said that's a really bad idea. And so we didn't do that, but we knew who they were, and they coincidentally reached out to us without any knowledge. We did publish the cities, but they reached out about their freight cost, because what was interesting is whether or not they're paying attention or not, the fleets actually have optionality as to whether they'll take the freight. And that's a different element than you've seen before.
And so maybe their problem was reputation-based, but now that the data's out there, I think everybody's going to have access to what really happened.
And I think it's really telling in the tweener market, and you compare, so one of the other the data sets that we like to look at is length of haul, because we believe that rejections actually are highly correlated to not only price, but actually a lane and what the length of haul is, and where you would actually expect to see the most dramatic impact to, there's our internet, the Wi-Fi issues, where you would expect to see, sorry, yes, we have them too, where you would expect to see the length of haul issues is in those tweener markets.
Yeah.
And so we saw that. Unfortunately, we don't have the data available right this second. But you saw that in the local city-owned, or cities themselves, you were about 8% rejections. The tender rejections
so
were about 8%.
sub 100 mile, yeah.
And in the tweener market, it was in the 30s and 40%, which means the market is carriers are rationally responding to the conditions. The other interesting element to that is that the long haul market actually has become far more efficient and far less rejections than what we've seen. It's about 18%. So it's suggesting that rejections are directly correlated to length of haul.
Sure. Have you seen, let's expand upon that, Craig, just a little bit, seen within the tweener market, as Dean described, can't be served by that individual driver. Obviously, carriers with teams, I would assume, are probably in better position today.
You know, I would expect to see companies that have high correspondence to teams. And so I always, if you kind of know the nature of each carrier, some carriers have more teams than others. And the interesting thing is if you're looking at different carrier profiles, this stuff's pretty predictive. I mean, and in many ways it's commoditized markets. And so the nature of the fleet will actually drive their yield and their ability to respond. So you would expect an environment where shippers have been dependent upon the owner-operators to provide capacity. Right. What was happening is when that capacity dried up for them, they were kind of forced to use teams if they wanted overnight service. And so fleets that have a large amount of teams actually have done exceptionally well. And you see that in the public equities, the companies that have a high number of teams. I mean, everybody's doing well. Some of them have been outsized.
Interesting.
And this is actually...
Yeah, both you guys have talked about tender reject.
This is actually the link
I was going to say,
so
this is like the whole piece. Why don't we do that?
TTRI is tweener.usa. That's the United States. Yeah. LTRI is long haul, and you can actually see it in the distance is directly correlated to the amount of rejections you see.
So you hear us talking a lot about TRI and tender reject. You want to do a little bit more on tender rejection and what that means in the market?
Earlier is just the idea that fleets, whether they have optionality, will accept a load or not, and by knowing that is either going to drive inflation in the spot market or create an environment where carriers are in a deflationary environment.
Gotcha.
Now, the interesting thing is it doesn't actually mean the contract market is, you know, and there's some analysts in the rooms, it doesn't mean if the spot market's soft that the contract market's not. In fact, if you go look at it, carriers are getting 10, 12, in sometimes cases 18% rate increases, and it's because they were able to convince shippers to pay the higher price in the contract market. And that's actually probably what you see in that April dip is related to the fact that shippers were now getting capacity.
Got it. I would do us an injustice if we had our chief economist and I didn't ask about what you think the economy is doing. I think there's the old saying is you put 10 economists in a room and you'll get 11 different opinions. So we'll just go for one right now. How do you think the economy is going, Ibrahim?
I still think things are going pretty well in the economy, especially as it relates to freight demand. You know, the U.S. economy is predominantly made up of services, and so there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the economy that doesn't necessarily involve movements of goods from one point to the other. But the things that we tend to pay attention to are things that connect to the flow of goods directly, so things like retail sales and industrial production and things of that nature. And there were some areas of weakness a little bit earlier in the year. Some of that was hangover from a really strong fourth quarter, but I think most of the fundamentals in the economy still look pretty positive. Mm-hmm. You're starting to see retail spending pick back up after a couple of weak months. Industrial production is still going strong. You know, not everything is going perfectly in the economy. There's still some areas of softness, but I think things still look pretty strong. And so what this means is that even though some of the volatility is gone that existed in freight markets from earlier this year, you know, as Craig mentioned, a lot of that has to do with the idea of like contracts just being able to reset and adjust, taking away some of the need to dig into the spot market. Even though some of that is gone, capacity is still going to be pretty tight going forward, and this means that the freight market is going to be very sensitive to surges in demand or drop-offs in demand, and so you know there's still this kind of sensitivity that exists in spot markets.
Gotcha. Daniel, has your data analysis shown any of the softness in certain markets that Ibrahim has described?
I mean, we've kind of seen where we said April was not as hot as expected.
Right.
You know, kind of the post-Easter, we've been waiting on it. It appears to be showing up in May, but you know, one of the markets that Ibrahim always talks about is energy. So I think when you look at energy, you're looking at flatbeds, frac sand, price of oil. And so we absolutely do see, you know, in the regions where you have frac sand and in flatbed demand's just been just off the charts. If you, do you pull up the barometer for flatbed? And
It's inconveniently named BARF.
Yeah. Well,
but
I mean, if you're trying to hire a flatbed, it makes you want to
Donald
barf.
Broughton can take credit
Yeah.
for that. So this is the barometer. This is actually flatbed volume, and you can see how on fire the flatbed market's been. And if you paid attention to the data, that would suggest it. We believe that what's driving that is the high oil prices.
Yep.
And so if you look at the lanes that are actually having substantial amount of demand, it's in that Houston to Midland to Texas, Midland lane and so forth. So.
Ibrahim, consistent with what you're seeing happening in oil?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody that's been paying attention over the past couple months knows that the price of oil and fuel has gone up quite a bit.
You want a crystal ball for us a little bit here? I'm sure the people out here would really be interested in
I can give you a little insight, at least I can try. You know, there's an old narrative that kind of exists that says that rising oil prices are bad for the economy, right? That if the price of oil gets too high, it raises fuel costs, and that spills over into other costs, and it reduces overall economic activity. This is also true for freight markets in sort of the classic sense. But the past few years have been quite a bit different, you know, because of the fact that the U.S. now produces a lot more oil domestically. You know, this narrative that oil prices are bad doesn't necessarily hold anymore. The last time we had an oil price spike, it led to a big expansion in the amount of oil that the U.S. economy was producing, and all of a sudden you saw like mining and drilling become like a significant contributor to overall economic growth. And the same sort of thing for freight movements. Every time there's a new rig that opens up, that's like an additional million more truck miles that has to be moved throughout the economy. And so, you know, you look at this rise in oil prices, and you don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Moreover, there's this idea that most of the things that are causing the oil price to rise are things that are outside of the United States economy, right? And so it's things like sanctions on Iran, or you know, the trouble that's going on in Venezuela, or the caps that OPEC's putting on production, right? And this is driving the Brent price of oil up a lot faster than it is WTI, you know, this West Texas intermediate oil that exists in the economy. And so this means that for U.S. producers of oil, they're actually at a bit of an advantage relative to the rest of the world, and I think they stand to benefit quite a bit from the rise in oil prices recently.
You know, it's interesting when you think about freight flows and the commodities. So if you think if oil prices actually are on fire, and you think about freight, that means that companies that are supplying, we've seen the flatbed volume, but you can also think about like fracking sands, and where are those sources of commodities? Because if you can figure out where actually you have demand, and as long as that spread stays high, which I think now that we can export diesel and things like that, we'll continue to do it, then the economic activity where this is a map actually of sand sources, if you're interested, I think this is kind of cool, because you'll see economic activity, and this is directly where sand is actually going into the fracking. So fracking sand is on fire. I never thought, you know, 2 years ago that sand would be this hot commodity, but it actually turned out that way.
So the impact, flatbed in this area is going towards sand, and so now
not flat. I mean, you can't put sand on a flatbed. But what it means is that you're building these ecosystems, because if you think about being the commodities, sand is a relatively interchangeable commodity. It's a uniform commodity. Certain types have different variances. But it means you can't truck it very far. And so if you're going to produce oil and be drilling and doing fracking like they do in Oklahoma or in Texas, you're going to have high pockets of sand activity and economic activity. In fact, we went out and studied the oil markets. For every fracking rig that's created in the United States is 1.1 million truckload miles. And that has a multiplier impact. And if we look at the rigs are 600, 700 over the last 2 years, since we've kind of recovered, that has put a lot of demand into the freight market. So I mean, piping and different supplies. So, and the thing about these fracking services is they're not piping it, because these tend to be shorter duration sites, and so they don't have as much infrastructure as you would see, and it's faster, right, in terms of the velocity that you would see in some of the other locations.
talked a lot about commodities, Daniel. What other commodities have you seen impacting the marketplace in the recent months?
So about a week and a half ago, and I think it was Zach that spotted our, the Midwest just turned bright blue on our tender rejections. We said, what's going on here? And did a couple of channel checks, talked to a few different people in the market, and they said, yeah, it's, crops that have been overwintered. I mean, it's getting warmer, so you're starting to get ag. Crops that have been overwintered, they're going to rot if we don't start moving them. And so there was quite a bit of haul, from facilities to barge or, facilities to processing. And when you take that bright blue central column of the country and you overlay kind of ag, where the government says ag is being produced, they really line up really well. So there's your ag regions.
Going back to that tender, can you go back, Zach, to the tender of the OTRAC? So you go back to, this is where the ag markets are, and so as you alluded to, you might have been elated, but where you see high demand, all of a sudden that part of the market turned blue, and it was really kind of shocking because, it wasn't shocking, but it was surprising how fast it became. A lot more rejections in the market. In some of the markets, like Omaha, had actually doubled almost overnight. So we sell a high rejections, and Zach actually was able to figure out that these were coming from communities that had chicken plants or food and cereal products coming out of those regions, which were driving a lot of demand for trucks in those markets, and we're soaking up all the available trucks.
It's interesting. We've just mentioned Zach, just for everybody to know, Zach Strickland. That's Teller over there. So
he's not allowed to.
He's not allowed to talk, but he is allowed to find out interesting and amazing things within the marketplace. So thank you for doing so, Zach. I'm going to switch now real quick to a topic that is today and the future. And Ibrahim, you get to step up on this one, and this one you got to be right about. The Amazon effect. It's a mandatory thing in every transportation and logistics and technology conference right now. You got to mention Amazon. So we're going to do the Amazon effect. We're going to do e-commerce, and then we'll, where do you see the impact on the providers in the transportation market today?
Well, I mean, rightfully so that it's brought up everywhere because it's one of the most transformative kind of things that's happened in the transportation space over the last decade. The rise of e-commerce has really altered expectations for consumers, and it's changed the way that freight has flowed throughout the U.S. economy. It's hard to mention e-commerce without mentioning Amazon. I mean, Amazon drives a lot of growth in e-commerce. They're also at or near the forefront of most of the major developments in e-commerce, and if they're not at the forefront, they're responsible for making it mainstream. The obvious thing about e-commerce is it adds an extra leg of transportation because you now have to get it to the last mile, to the end consumer. But I'm much more interested in sort of how things have changed relative to price expectations and the speed of delivery over the past several years. One of the things that Amazon did is not only did they expand e-commerce marketplaces, but they set this expectation that shipping is going to be free to the end consumer. So this constrains retailers quite a bit because they now have to find ways to get things to the end consumer without making them incur any additional cost. And then on top of that, it has to be delivered quickly. Right, and this is part of what Amazon helped make mainstream through their Prime program. That now, not only do you expect it free, you also expect it within 2 days, and now it's getting, that window of delivery gets shorter and shorter every year. And so what this does is it changes the way companies have to think about how they do transportation. Like the old way used to be, you would store a lot of things in a massive warehouse in the middle of the country where land was kind of cheap. You could buy like a massive warehouse and just drop everything off and make your deliveries as you needed to that way. But if you need to get things to the end consumer quickly, that means you need to locate close to the end consumer. So you've started to see distribution centers and warehouses that pop up right outside of major population centers, right? There's a few big ones right outside of Atlanta. And it's all with this idea of trying to deliver things with speed. Now, Amazon doesn't, they don't have a full-fledged delivery network, at least not yet, right? And so they partner with carriers. And so this relationship between Amazon and the carriers is a fascinating one. It's a little bit of a love-hate kind of thing.
Well, let me give you a little love-hate let's get a little controversial up here, okay? I asked Dean if he was asleep at the wheel, and I was talking about drivers cheating. You talk about these providers that are being affected by the Amazon e-commerce effect. we, the public, being ripped off by the USPS? I'm doing a little, you know, a little work for the White House up here, just trying to help out, you know, help out a guy who needs some help right now.
I mean, you can always start this discussion with the idea that the post office does lose money, right? I mean, like, pretty consistently over the last decade, they've kind of lost money every year. And when they lose money, essentially taxpayers are subsidizing this to kind of keep them in operations as they lose. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. You know, consider that the U.S. Postal Service still delivers just regular mail. And it's still a big chunk of their business, and it's a steadily declining part of the business. And that's the primary reason behind most of their losses. You know, on the package side, they probably need to do a little bit more on the pricing side to help cover some of those losses elsewhere so that they're not losing money in aggregate. But I don't know if it's necessarily at the extreme that the news might make it out to be. You know, the thing about Amazon, and I mentioned there's kind of goods and bads there, the benefit that all of these carriers enjoy through partnerships with Amazon is they get great density. Mm-hmm. Like if you're a parcel shipper, you really want your trucks to be full when you're going out to neighborhoods.
Right.
It doesn't make a whole lot, I mean, it's not very profitable to go to a neighborhood if you only have one package. It's much better if you have like 30 packages that you can do in one area. So Amazon brings a great amount of density to what it is that they do. But on the other hand, they also bring a lot of leverage. Like Amazon knows very well that they bring a lot of packages. Right. And so they're able to kind of use that leverage to get pretty low rates for things. And I think that's kind of what the USPS is experiencing right now. Gotcha. You know, the president and politicians have kind of drawn it out as a political point, but it's, you know, they have to negotiate these kind of things, and Amazon is a tough negotiator, and anybody that's in here that's had to do business with Amazon from that perspective knows for sure.
I appreciate that, but I'll take the answer to my question as a yes. You think that the USPS is ripping us off. So looking at the clock, we've really running down on time. I'm going to apologize. We are really keeping tight, so from a Q&A perspective, we won't be able to take any Q&A after these next couple of questions I have, but I would please ask you to find the panelists outside during the networking time frame. But Craig, I want to turn to you on a couple of final topics here. First and foremost, with everything we've heard from the wonderful keynoters already today, and what we'll hear from Bettina, obviously blockchain is a very important part of what these last 3 days have been about. What do you see as the timeline for blockchain standards?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we get asked this a lot. So we've had 2 meetings. November, we hope that this has been an improvement over the one November. Certainly well better attended. We hope so. What I would say is there's a lot of interest among folks that come to the standards meetings to have instant standards. Right. And what I would argue is that what you actually need are companies that are doing interesting things around blockchain and large commercial enterprises that actually have scale and depth that can help partner and commercialize those activities will create a far better outcome as it relates to standards once they're adopted, because you can't create a standard until you have consensus, and you can't have consensus unless you've had a lot of trial and error. And so what I'm hoping comes out of the next last couple of days and going forward is that we think of standards as the long-term goal so that we're all in the same framework. But we think about short-term, how do we create commercial outcomes that really are effective in doing this stuff? And so if you think about the way we've tried to build this particular event the last couple of days is we started with standards to kind of lay out the framework and the plan, but it's hard to create standards until you have outcomes. And what we're hoping to do is bridge the gap between some of the new voices, some of the really innovative companies with some of the largest commercial companies and mid-sized companies that were innovative to come together to help solve these problems. And that's what I hope this community really represents.
Excellent, excellent. Last one as the clock ticks down on us, but this panel, and I'll say thank you because we're going to get rushed off here to go to the next one, but one comment about the topic was the future of freight. So you've done a lot around thinking about and then getting towards a freight futures market. Can you give us an update on the freight futures?
Yeah, so we're planning to launch later this year along partnerships with DAT. We believe that DAT is the benchmark price of the truckload market. And so the futures contracts are never physically settled, they're financially. I always tell folks, If you're trading futures and expecting a truck to show up, we will have 100% service failure because a truck will never show up in a financially settled futures market. And so that is expected to launch in October, November of this next year. And another partner is Nodal. So the contracts themselves will be traded on Nodal's exchange, which is a part of Deutsche Börse. And Nodal will list those contracts. And so we're excited about what that means. And I think for all of this element, whether it's the spot market volatility that we've seen, particularly over the last 12 months, but also the data that may come off that, hopefully that creates more transparency for the market.
Appreciate that. And one final thing in that regard, we think we've done a fantastic job with regards to all of the interactions that we've had out on the floor. The next time we'll have that opportunity is at Market Waves, which will be in November 10 through 12, I believe. So that'll be right around that time frame, 12 through something like that, in that general vicinity. So if the Grapevine will be there, and we'll have just on the futures.
Yeah, just a little quick preview to that. So same format, demos, but we're trying to put in obviously more supply chain folks we think will improve and scale the amount of shippers that are actually in the room. It's also a bit oriented more to the quantitative side of things, or the price analysts and how they think about the 2019 and beyond freight markets, because they think, if does the economy hold up, or does it go? I think a lot of those questions will be. We'll continue to have to answer those. And one of the things about volatility or transparency is it does create a level of volatility as the information happens faster than it's ever happened. So everyone, we'd love to have hopefully host you there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, guys.